Justin Trudeau is the picture-perfect politician. Under his premiership, Canada's refugee policy credentials have been touted far and wide. No more so than when his newly elected government promised to take in 25,000 Syrian refugees. And it did. Fast forward to 2017 and the newly sworn-in president south of the border was vowing to impose a travel ban on 7 predominantly Muslim nations. Trudeau countered with this message. To those fleeing persecution, terror and war, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. #Welcome to Canada. A division clearly on display at their first meeting.
We cannot let the wrong people in, and I will not allow that to happen during this administration.
We continue to pursue our policies of openness towards immigration and refugees without compromising security.
The change in US politics has had an immediate effect on its neighbour. And the Trudeau government has been criticised for not being proactive and preparing for a refugee influx. A surge of people has crossed over illegally to lodge asylum claims in Canada, many undertaking the journey in harsh winter conditions. That increase has created a backlog of claims, testing the integrity of the Canadian immigration system and raising concerns about the security risk for the country. A poll earlier this year showed 48% of Canadians were in favour of sending illegal arrivals back to the US. Canada ranks 15th on the list of industrialised nations which accept asylum seekers. This year, the Canadian government is planning to take in 25,000 refugees. But more than half will be privately sponsored by individuals or community groups, and they alone will take responsibility for the newcomers. Raising questions about the generosity of the government and the Prime Minister, who has actively promoted Canada as a leader in addressing the world's refugee crisis. Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Toronto is former Canadian Minister for Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, Chris Alexander. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. Good to have you on the program. I know you're from the other side of the political fence. However, are you impressed by or proud of the current immigration policies under the Liberals?
I am actually a huge fan of our refugee resettlement programs, our asylum programs, and our immigration programs. I think it is a comparative advantage for Canada. Globally, it's made our economy strong, and it's allowed us to show leadership at a time of great humanitarian crisis in the world. But yes, I have some real issues with how our new Liberal government is approaching this issue. They are creating incentives for irregular migration to Canada to grow, which will undermine our ability to do safe refugee resettlement on a large scale. And I worry about what that holds for the future. Okay, so when you say irregular migration, are you referring maybe specifically to the Mexicans who are now crossing the border? It's visa-free for them to go as tourists, but many want to work in Canada. They're being detained. As far as I understand, Canada detained more Mexican migrants in the first 2 months of 2017 than it did in all of 2016. That was more than 400 people. Is that what you're talking about? We lift visa requirements for countries on the basis of objective criteria. We evaluate how many asylum claims there have been, how many people overstay their visas. When we see stability, when we see a normalization of those people-to-people relations between us and a partner country, then we lift the visa requirement. And we've done that for dozens of countries in recent decades. Those criteria haven't been met in the case of Mexico. And so instead of giving hundreds of thousands of Mexicans visas, multiple entry visas, and holding them to account to respect the terms of those visas, now we're asking all Mexicans, giving all Mexicans the opportunity to come here with visa-free without being able to evaluate whether they are criminals, part of drug cartels, or here for the wrong reasons. Right. And so yes, asylum claims are going up. We had, back in 2008, almost 10,000 asylum claims just from Mexico. And that's a problem because it takes resources away from helping true refugees, those who are fleeing conflict, those who really deserve Canada's protection and Canada's support.
Yeah, something that's really interesting in a Reuters piece, Alejandro Becerra was profiled, a 30-year-old former bank teller from Mexico City. He spoke of a construction job that he was offered in Canada. He went on the visa-free regime. The immigration officer asked him, why are you coming into Canada? He said, I'm here as a tourist. They looked at his phone. They found there was communication regarding the potential job offer. Of course, they detained him and then they sent him back to Mexico, and I'm presuming he's sort of banned in some way or another. Now, ironically, Canada seems open, and making it visa-free for Mexicans makes Canada seem even more open. Ironically, that sounds very much like somebody being treated by Donald Trump's America. Hey, why are you here? You want a job? Go back. We're going to send you back. So is Canada going to find itself in these kind of moral and political, hypocritical conundrums?
I very much hope not. I mean, listen, Donald Trump came to power in the United States for various reasons, controversy over trade, jobs. But one of the reasons was a large population in the United States of people who came there by irregular and often very dangerous means, and who are there in an undocumented way. That creates controversy. Obama couldn't deal with the issue despite deporting larger numbers than any previous president, and Trump promised to deal with the issue. I doubt very much that he's on a course to success, but the restrictions he's put in place mean that Canada needs to respond. I think we should be generously receiving those asylum claimants who will no longer have their cases heard in the United States, and doing that at our borders. I think we should be doing more than our Trudeau Liberal government is doing, but at the same time, we should be working very hard to avoid the situation the US and many European countries found themselves in, where this huge part of the population don't have their rights respected, don't have regular immigration status, and have come here, often thanks to human smugglers or other networks that help them, in spite of the rules, by circumventing the rules. Rule-based immigration, rule-based refugee resettlement are the solution for the future, and we would like to see more of Canada's resources go to resettling Syrian refugees, resettling people who are fleeing conflict in Central America, resettling people who are fleeing conflict in South Asia, rather than going to people who are coming from relatively safe countries and simply breaking the rules.
This is interesting because you say rule-based, right? But that's really flexible and elastic, isn't it, given the current nature of all these conflicts? As somebody who would have been evaluating these things as they went along as the immigration minister, who gets to decide which conflicts take preference, which are the priority conflicts? So, okay, you say Syria, maybe Iraq, Yemen, you said Central America. What if you're an Afghan fleeing? At the moment, Afghanistan is not deemed a place in a state of war, so many Afghan refugees in many parts of the world are sent back, only to more bombs and chaos in places like Kabul. So which countries are top of the pile?
Well, listen, anyone who gets here and makes an asylum claim will have that claim heard. And the success rate for Afghan claimants has gone up in recent years. I think the number was between 500 and 1,000 successful claims last year. So it's not for me to decide which claims are valid. We do that with our professional immigration and refugee officers, working with the UNHCR, working with other partners, and with an impartial immigration and refugee board in Canada that makes decisions in these cases. But Canada has a privilege that other countries don't have in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and elsewhere, because we do not have borders close to your part of the world, close to Syria and the major sources of new refugee flows. We can continue to expect relatively low levels of asylum claims while increasing our safe refugee resettlement. I am a firm believer that the best solution is to have larger numbers of countries taking refugees directly from camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and other places, bringing them safely to our countries instead of forcing them to take dangerous journeys over land or those perilous voyages on the Mediterranean, which have cost 25,000 lives since the year 2000. Right. That is a cost that is far too high for humanity to pay. And I would like to see Canada manage its asylum claims well, so that we don't have abuse, and increase its refugee resettlement from Syria and elsewhere. Before the Liberal government came in, we had resettled successfully 26,000 Iraqi and Syrian refugees. No other country had done that. And your earlier point about us having low numbers of refugees in Canada per capita, that only applies to asylum seekers. If you take asylum claimants out who actually vote with their feet and look at safely resettled refugees who are brought here by states, and in our case by private sponsors, we have the highest level of effort in the world. And I think a lot of countries are taking interest in that, in our experience, and looking to emulate it in future.
So would you suggest that there shouldn't be a cap on private sponsorships?
Absolutely not. It is one of the biggest mistakes of this current government to refuse the generosity of Canadians, to say, no, you've brought these resources together in your mosque, in your church group, in your community group. We are not going to help a Syrian with that. Instead, we're going to use taxpayers' money. All the research shows that private sponsorship leads to better outcomes. Right. It leads to more success for refugees, and we should not be capping that effort on the part of Canadians.
I want to pivot to something that is deeply personal for you, and happened towards the end of your time in the administration. The Alan Kurdi issue, that little boy who washed up on the beaches of Turkey, a Syrian refugee, young boy, he and his family, well, many members of his family, didn't make it. You were hammered for it because presumably initially it was said that you rejected his father Abdullah's asylum application. It turned out that you'd rejected his uncle's application. It had nothing to do directly with the family. You still got hammered for it. And there was a stain on the entire administration, the entire Harper administration. I know you got a lot of ugly criticism as well, and trolling for it. In retrospect, what would you have done differently?
Well, first, that was a heartbreaking moment for the whole world to see this boy's body. I've had the chance to relive it with Alan Kurdi's aunt, Tima Kurdi, who lives in Coquitlam, British Columbia. We hugged each other. We told our respective stories. We're still broken and haunted by those memories. But Syrians, and many of us, are haunted most of all by the failure of the international community to stop these refugee flows and to stop the conflict. And so what would we have done differently? What would I have done differently? I think we should have acted faster, earlier, to do more. I was the first minister in any country in the world, including the United States, to announce that we would safely resettle 10,000 Syrian refugees. We did that in January 2015, 9 months before Alan Kurdi's death. But we should have implemented that faster and scaled up faster as the crisis hit new peaks of urgency in the summer of 2015. I didn't have the support of all of my colleagues in government at that time. I don't think they saw how important this issue was going to be, and we should have done more faster. But I fault the current government for not sustaining the effort that the higher pace of resettlement that they maintained for a few months after coming into office. As you pointed out, it has dropped off. We shouldn't be acting on the basis of political expediency. We should be acting on the basis of humanitarian urgency. And I would like to see us doing more to stop the war, to ensure Bashar al-Assad is not able to kill his own people on the scale he has done now for 6 years. And I would like to see Canada showing leadership on refugee resettlement. There are many countries in the world, in Europe and elsewhere, that could be safely resettling more refugees, but that has to go together with a rule-based system and reforms of the asylum system to make sure these hundreds of thousands of people who've fled for their lives across the Mediterranean are not exposed to the dangers that we've seen over the last couple of decades. It's a big agenda, but I think there are solutions. And yes, some of those lessons have to be drawn from our election and from our reforms and our efforts to live up to our reputation for humanitarian action. We're celebrating the 100,000 plus Vietnamese boat refugees we brought here under a Conservative government initially. a few decades ago. We should be undertaking an effort on that scale, or an even larger scale, I think, for refugees fleeing the current conflict in Syria and Iraq.
Typical polite Canadians, you know, when I cover other stories, usually the politician from the other side of the fence only flings dirt at the current administration. It's been fantastic talking to you, Chris Alexander. Wish you all the best. Thank you so much.